Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the 8th edition of the Ask an Expert webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about the planning process of the Offshore Wind Regulator, Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Wind Regulator, sorry. My name is Claire Kleinecht. I'm the Research and Engagement Officer at Marine Renewables Canada, and I'm going to be hosting the session today. For folks that might be new to MRC, we are a national industry association focused on tidal, offshore wind, wave, and river current energy. And we've been hosting this webinar series for the last year or two to tackle some of Canadians' biggest questions related to offshore wind. Before we get started today, I'm going to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge the traditional territories and Indigenous peoples of the different lands that we are all on today. I'm hosting this webinar from Mi'kmaq, the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Given that we're coming together today to discuss offshore wind, I also invite us all to think about the impacts that renewable energy projects can have on Indigenous communities and how we can improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures to ensure that marine renewable energy projects move forward in an inclusive and respectful way. Just a few quick housekeeping notes as well. We will be recording this webinar and it'll be posted to MRC's webpage, as well as our YouTube channel following the session. So if you have folks that you would like to share this with following, please do. The bulk of the webinar today will be a presentation from our guest speaker, followed by a Q&A session at the end. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom toolbar on your window to submit questions. Now I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Kris Kendell, the Director of Resources and Rights and the Chief Conservation Officer at the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Energy Regulator. Kris manages the call for bids process for licenses, advises on geoscience matters relating to energy exploration, development, and production, and reviews geoscience aspects of industry-submitted activity authorizations. Today, Kris is joining us to give us an overview of the offshore renewable land tenure process he is currently leading and share how folks can participate in the process. So thank you, Kris. Please take it away.
Thank you, Claire. Share my screen here. So thank you, Claire, for the introduction and MRC for the invitation to speak here today. What I'm going to do over the next 35 minutes or so is introduce you to the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Regulator, the area that we have jurisdiction over. We're going to walk through some of our open processes, which are in particular, in this case, a call for information and pre-qualification. And then I'll end on a few slides on what comes after someone has a license as issued upon the conclusion of these processes. So I'd first like to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kmaq, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So who is the CNSOER? So it's an acronym and it stands for Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Energy Regulator. So we are the lead and lifecycle regulator for offshore energy. We have been a regulator for 35 years. And as of January 31st of this past year, we've had renewables added to our mandate. For those first 30, from 1990 onwards, we were traditionally a regulator for offshore petroleum. And we had a name change and a brand change as of the end of January, where we've migrated from the CNSOPB to the CNSOER, which you see today. So we are an independent joint agency created by the governments of Canada and Nova Scotia, and we report to two ministers. So we report to the federal minister, which is of Natural Resources Canada, and the provincial minister within the Nova Scotia Department of Energy. We recognize that safety and environmental protection are paramount in everything that we do while regulating offshore energy. Our mandate is laid out in the legislation, which you'll hear me refer to throughout this presentation as the Accord Acts. Within our mandate is the health and safety of offshore workers, the protection of the environment, administration of land tenure processes, and the management of licenses, which is the bulk of the presentation that I'm giving to you here today. Geoscience evaluation, data collection, curation, and distribution, management and conservation of the offshore petroleum resources, and Canada-Nova Scotia employment and industrial benefits for petroleum-related activities as well. Engagement is important to us, and it's an integral part of our values. For the past 35 years, we've been engaging with Indigenous groups and rights holders, fishers and our Fisheries Advisory Committee, municipalities, offshore workforce, industry, public, and governments, and we continue to do so going forward. To help with engagement in these processes, we have an introductory participant funding program in place. I encourage you to go to our website to find out more about this process and how to participate if needed. So if you're looking for some financial support so that you can participate in the engagement processes that I'm going to speak to you about today, I encourage you to go to our website, download some forms, ask some questions, and reach out to us. If you have already participated in this program, we're also looking for feedback on how it's gone. So please submit feedback within our call for information feedback forms, which are also available on our website. So what is the area that we have jurisdiction over? So for anyone who is perhaps not too familiar, we're looking at a map here of the eastern portion of Canada. You can see Newfoundland and Labrador up in the right-hand corner here, Nova Scotia in the central part of the map, New Brunswick, and then the northeastern portion of the United States here with Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. What I'm going to highlight here in yellow is our jurisdiction. So everything that's bounded by this yellow line, so within this area offshore Nova Scotia, is what the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Energy Regulator has jurisdiction over. So to the east, you can see where we share a boundary with Newfoundland and Labrador, our sister organization, the Canada-Nova Scotia, or the Canada-Newfoundland Offshore Energy Regulator. And to the west, we share a boundary with the United States. And you can see here that we just within this map, there are areas here where there have been offshore wind licenses for development issued offshore Massachusetts and also in the Gulf of Maine. So this is described in the Accord Acts, and this is really the outer limit of our jurisdiction. What I'm going to move to show you on the next slide is our inner limits of the offshore area, which is where the limits as we approach the onshore portions of Nova Scotia. So the outer limits, as I pointed out, are noted on this map as well as here in the dashed stipple line, which you can see here. We have some protected areas in pink here, marine protected areas. So this is St. Anne's Bank, and this is the Gully. And what I have noted here are the other 5 bays that are specifically written in legislation as being provincial waters. So these areas are A, Chignecto Bay, the small sliver of offshore area between ourselves and New Brunswick. We have B, the Minas Channel, which is this area in here. C, St. Mary's Bay, down around the Digby region. We have D, Chedabucto Bay, up near Canso. And then E, also here, St. George's Bay. So these are provincial waters and therefore fall under provincial jurisdiction. Probably many Marine Renewables Canada members are familiar with some of the tidal developments. Those would be happening in these provincial waters to date. If something were to occur outside of these provincial waters, it's likely to fall under the jurisdiction of the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Energy Regulator. If you want to find out more information about this inner limit or the outer limits of the offshore area, I encourage you to look at the Schedule 1 of the Accord Acts posted online. Okay, so let's get right to the topic at hand here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the land tenure processes for NS25-1. So that's the terminology we use to note the call for bids processes that are underway as we speak right now. So the best way to walk through the land tenure processes is to use this Accord Acts Offshore Renewable Energy Land Tenure Process Chart. So you can find this chart on our website, link down here if you're looking to download it. If you've been engaged with us at all, it's probably a chart that you're already familiar with, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through this chart through a series of slides and in a bit more detail. So on the left-hand side is the chart from top to bottom. It is a process that starts with step 1 and ends with step 10. Step 1 being some sort of regional assessment and step 10 being the issuance of a license. Don't try and read this chart on the left-hand side here as it is right now. What I am going to do on the following slides is break it into bite-sized pieces and bring them up on the screen in an easier to read format. What I do want to point out before we get to this is there is a valuable color coding denomination within this chart. So anything that's colored in blue is a government-led step. So what you can see is there's definitely steps like 1 through 3, which are government-led. Anything colored in orange is a regulator-led step, so a step led by myself or other staff members at the CNSOER. And the same color coding applies to any engagements that falls within each step. So you can see government-led engagement is colored in blue with this symbol right here, and regulator-led engagement is colored in orange with this symbol here as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this chart top to bottom, which is a sequence and it is a process. We are currently in step 4, but what I am going to do is I'm going to walk through the chart in its full completion, and then we're going to come back in and dive into step 4 itself and talk about how you can be involved in the engagement, the pre-qualification, or lands nominations that fall within step 4. So let's look at the top 2 processes here. So the step 1 is a regional assessment or strategic environmental assessment. So this is where governments support the implementation of and consider findings from a regional assessment or a strategic environmental assessment to identify optimal areas for future projects, identify data gaps relevant to optimal areas, and provide recommendations on mitigating potential impacts. So the way this was done in this current process that we are currently in is it was a regional assessment of offshore wind development in Nova Scotia. So some work started in 2023. The committee held many public meetings throughout the Maritimes, met with a wide range of stakeholders and summarized this all very well in a series of reports. I have the reports linked here in this presentation. There was a draft report put out on October 31st of 2024 and their final report in January 23rd of 2025. These play a huge role in setting up the foundation for the rest of these processes here. The second step is the designation of wind energy areas. So based on the findings from an RA or an SCA, so in this case, based on the findings of the regional assessment of offshore wind development in Nova Scotia, the governments evaluate these findings, identify and engage on proposed wind energy areas, and then designate the wind energy areas. Governments may use previous regional assessments or strategic environmental assessments or new ones to identify wind energy areas in the future as well. So wind energy areas were jointly designated by governments formally on July 29th of this year. So the government designated wind energy areas look like this map that you see on here. So they have designated 4 areas. It's Sydney Bight up offshore Cape Breton, French Bank, Middle Bank, and Sable Island Bank. So again, these were designated on July 29th of this year. There's a bit of history here to how these designated areas came to be, which I'm going to walk you through here in a couple slides. So to begin with, there's no wind energy areas on the map at this point, but I would just like to point out Nova Scotia and the 25-kilometer buffer that's in place around its coastline, and also the Sable Island National Park Reserve offshore, and a 25-kilometer buffer around Sable Island as well. So in January 23 of 2025, the regional assessment of offshore wind development in Nova Scotia, this was the final report. And what it identified are potential development areas that were informed by technical studies, geological surveys, environmental data, fishing activity, and community feedback. And what they have done here is there's eight areas identified, and these 8 areas are in 2 tiers. So a tier 1 is a priority consideration as a prospective wind energy area. And these are the ones noted on the map that are in the solid lines. So at this point, there was tier 1, there was Sydney Bight, French Bank, Middle Bank, Sable Island Bank, and Emerald Bank. The ones noted here in dashed lines are tier 2, and they were requiring additional investigation and or stakeholder engagement, including with indigenous communities. You can find further information about this on page 242 of the final report for the regional assessment of offshore wind development. The tier 2 areas were Canso Bank, Missain Bank, and Lahade Basin. We then moved forward to March 14th of 2025, where the government's proposed wind energy areas. So these were proposed at this point, and they held a 30-day public comment period on these areas. That public comment period began on March 14th and it ended on April 14th. And what you can see, there was a change from their designation here, where the Mizane, Canso, and Lehave kind of dropped off. There was a change in the area covered by Emerald Bank. And you can also note that at this point, they've taken a bit of a different shape. And this is where governments have made these proposed wind energy areas snap to our land division guidelines, which are what we have in place for when we're drawing or drafting offshore boundaries for energy purposes. So following the 30-day public comment period, governments formally designated these 4 wind energy areas. So again, it's Sydney Bight, French Bank, Middle Bank, and Sable Island Bank. So the federal and provincial governments jointly identified these suitable potential areas for future offshore wind, call for bids, and possible developments. Following that, in a particular relevance to this presentation, on September 18th, governments within their strategic direction letter identified these 3 wind energy areas to go forward to be considered for future call for bids. So there's Sydney Bight, French Bank, and Middle Bank. Sable Island is not going forward within this current call for bids land tenure process. So we received joint direction from the Government of Canada and the Government of Nova Scotia to formally initiate this process to issue a call for bids for offshore wind within the Canada-Nova Scotia offshore area within these 3 wind energy areas. That we have this news release related to this information is available on our website. So I kind of touched on it here, but step 3, if we go back to our land tenure process chart, is receiving strategic direction from ministers. So this is where ministers provide joint direction to the regulator to design and implement a call for information process. And the details within the strategic direction could include the wind energy areas to be used, to identify the license areas, the timelines for the call for information, pre-qualification criteria, call for bids criteria, and the purpose for the electricity. And as I noted on the previous slide, this is something that we received and it was publicly posted on September 18th of this year. Also within that letter is that we had a 30-day time to start these processes, which is the next step on the process. And it's actually the first, if you're following the color coding, it's the first under orange colored step on here, which means it's a regulator-led step. So step 4, and this is where we are currently undertaking. This is the call for information and pre-qualification step. So this is where the regulator engages with stakeholders, fishers, and indigenous groups on the locations of parcels within the wind energy areas, the draft submerged land license, the proposed criteria, and the approach used in future call for bids. The regulator also concurrently administers a pre-qualification process to identify eligible companies that can participate in a future call for bids. So these are 2 processes running concurrently. This opened on October 16th. It's open for a period of 90 days, and it's closing January 13th of 2026. So I have a series of slides to walk you through the information related to call for information and pre-qualification, which we will come back to later on in the presentation. At this point, we're just going to keep going through the rest of the chart so that all the listeners can understand what happens throughout the rest of the land tenure process. So following the call for information and pre-qualification is another regulator-led step where the regulator makes a recommendation to the ministers to make a call for bids. The recommendation will outline the details of the call for bids, including the bidding criteria, how it will be assessed, terms and conditions for a submerged land license, the locations of the parcels that may be available for bid. And this information is informed by feedback from the call for information process. So following January 13th of 2026, the regulator has the big task on its hand to digest and consider all information received through the call for information feedback and use this information to inform our recommendation to ministers, which will be following the January 13th date. It's likely that the regulator requires somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks to consider all this information before making our recommendation to the ministers. Once our recommendation goes forward, we're into the next step, which is step 6 here, which is the ministerial decision on call for bids recommendation. So this is where the ministers jointly decide on the regulator's recommendation, and the minister's decision are also made public at this point. There is a defined time in legislation for this information to sit with ministers, where it can be for 60 days, and they can also request a 30-day extension before getting back to the regulator. The ministers will either approve, reject, or amend the recommendation as brought forward by the regulator. On to the next steps. So we're back to a regulator-led steps again here. So upon hearing back from the ministers and the ministerial's decision, the regulator would move forward with a call for bids. So this is where the regulator administers a public call for bids for the developers to bid on identified parcels and the associated submerged land licenses in line with its recommendation. As part of its responsibilities, the regulator also communicates with interested parties to share relevant information and field questions. So if you're counting days here, we've gone from mid-January, where the call for information and pre-qualification closes, to some time with the ministers. The ministers have now gotten back to us after a potential 90 days, and the call for bids will be open at this point for the regulator to administer. It's likely for a call for bids to be open for somewhere from 60 to 90 days. If there are people listening to this presentation that had feedback on the potential length for a call for bids to be open, we encourage you to submit that feedback through the call for information process. So once the call for bids is open for its allotted period of time, the regulator then would be making a recommendation to issue a submerged land license. So we would be reviewing the submissions received, and the regulator would make a recommendation to ministers to issue submerged land licenses or license to the winner of the call for bids. An important note here is that the only eligible companies to bid in the call for bids are ones who have made it through the pre-qualification process. So after our recommendation is given to ministers, they again have some time with this decision. And again, there is a time allotted in the legislation for the ministers, where they have 60 days plus a 30-day extension to make a decision on the regulator's recommendation. And at this point, again, the minister's decisions are public. So at that point, ministers would come back to us, the regulator, with guidance on issuing the submerged land license. So the regulator at this point would be issuing submerged land license or licenses to the winners of the call for bids. A submerged land license provides the exclusive right to develop a project in the license area, but it's important to note that it does not allow for any work or activity to take place. Developers must then first apply for project authorization under Part 3 of the Accord Acts. That's something that I'm going to touch on too near the end of my presentation. So we've just walked through the land tenure process from top to bottom. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to the step that we're currently focused on, which is the call for information and pre-qualification step. So again, it's the regulator-led call for information and pre-qualification process, and it opened on October 16th. It's going to be held open for a period of 90 days, closing on January 13th. So let's take a look at these processes and have a quick look through some of the process, what's available on our website, and how to participate. So first, we'll have a look at the pre-qualification. So the pre-qualification, the purpose of this is to review and identify eligible companies that can participate in the next offshore wind call for bids. So really, this is a threshold for companies to meet, where we want developers to pre-qualify, and once they are pre-qualified, it now makes them eligible to submit a bid in the upcoming call for bids. The companies are required to meet certain financial, technical, and legal social criteria, and broadly, they fall under these three categories noted here in bold. So we're looking to measure their financial capability. So through submissions of equity ratio or debt rating, we'll look at their annual turnover and net assets or funds under management. We're also looking at their technical expertise, so their direct experience in offshore wind development or relevant experience, so if they've been working offshore in the oil and gas environment or other renewable energy projects as well. And if they don't have these, we're looking for them to submit to us how they plan to access this external expertise. We're also looking for developers to submit their legal and social status, so their history of regulatory compliance, their history of maintaining health, safety, and environment and human rights standards, and other ethical conduct. There is a link directly to the offshore wind pre-qualification webpage at the bottom of this slide. And I'm going to show you some of the details up here. So on the right-hand side of the screen is an outline of the pre-qualification form in its entirety. And on the left-hand side is just a screen grab of one section of it, which I'll talk to in a second. So the outline on the right-hand side here is similar, but it's a bit expanded to what I just had on the previous slide. So within this pre-qualification form, the first few pages that you're going to look at are general information and instructions, which walk you through how to complete the pre-qualification form. The second section is where we're looking for the submissions of financial criteria. So it's separated out into 5 different parts. So part A, equity ratio; B, credit and debt rating; C, total annual revenue, gross annual sales, net assets, and then funds under management. Section 3 is where we're looking for submission for their technical criteria. So again, as mentioned, it's their offshore wind experience or other relevant experience, access to supplementary experience, and then we're also looking for them to submit to us their knowledge of the local supply chain. Section 4 is where they're submitting information about their legal and their social criteria. And Section 5 is their attestation and supporting information. Section 6 is where there's some space, additional space for them to submit information. We've spoken to a lot of other regulators around the world, and they've stressed on us the importance on having page limits on a lot of these processes. So the completed form, including all attachments other than the audited financial statements for Section 2, must not exceed 60 pages in length. So in other words, the audited financial statements do not count in that page count. We're looking for developers to honor the 60-page limit here. So on the left-hand side is an example for what a form looks like. So in particular, this is part E. So this is where if a developer was filling out their funds under management. So this is a fillable PDF where some boxes are set aside to directly type in and another larger space here to add additional information. We are receiving quite a few questions about pre-qualification. So for those questions, we encourage you to submit them to landtenure@cnsoer.ca. So this is a dedicated email address for questions as it relates to call for information or pre-qualification, sorry. Before submitting a question for pre-qualification, we encourage you to check the questions and answers that are published on our website. So for pre-qualification, we are treating this as if it was like a public procurement process. So any questions that come in are publicly posted on our website, the questions and the answers, once any identifying information has been removed from them. So they're posted for all interested companies to review. This document is updated as questions are received and answers are provided. The pre-qualifications can be found on the page dedicated to offshore wind pre-qualification. So we encourage you to submit your questions to that email address. Please refer to this document before asking any further questions. There's quite a few answered on here right now, and there's more in the queue about to be posted to the website in the near term. There is a good thing to note on this is that you will see an updated by or a last updated date. So in this case, I took this screen grab last night. The one that's up on our website right now is questions and answers as received by November 25th. So that was it for pre-qualification. The other process running concurrently to that is the call for information. So let's walk through some of the details related to call for information. So again, like the pre-qualification, it's open for 90 days, October 16th, and it's going to end on January 13th of 2026. As part of the offshore wind call for information, the CNSOER welcomes feedback on government strategic direction letter. So we invite Indigenous groups and rights holders, the fishing sector, industry, government, the public, and other stakeholders to provide their feedback on the wind energy areas being considered, the locations of potential parcels within these wind energy areas, the possible evaluation criteria to be used as part of the call for bids process, the possible draft terms and conditions for a submerged land license, and other details related to the strategic direction. So if you're familiar with the strategic direction letter that we received on September 18th, what we have done as the regulator is we've taken the details within that letter and we've kind of parsed it out into topical different sections. And that's what really forms the foundation of the call for information feedback form. So For example, if there's a section in there on call for bids criteria to be considered, we have that posted on the form, and then we have a blank spot underneath that for comments about that information in particular, which I'm going to show you on the next slide here. So here's a couple of screen grabs from the call for information feedback form itself. The portion on the left is the first page of the form, where we're looking for all your identifying information and whether consent is given to publicly post your comments or not. So you can see up at the top here in this gray section, there's some information on how to fill it out, where to pose your questions to, and the dates for when it's open and closed. There's a consent box here for whether or not you want your comments to be public or not. And then we're looking for your name, email address, who you represent, and who you identify as, and where you reside, and other identifying information. And similar to what I did for the pre-qualification form, I just have one page grabbed from the call for information feedback form. And in this case, the example section is where we're requesting feedback on potential evaluation criteria to be used in the call for bids process. So you can see here, this page in particular is the potential evaluation criteria. So the regulator is considering including, as part of the call for bids criteria, a measurement of technical expertise, financial strength and project delivery readiness, engagement and community benefits, supply chain and workforce development, and then environmental sustainability and coexistence. So if you have any comments on these being used, these criteria potentially being used in the call for bids process, we'd appreciate your feedback. And there's a form or empty space down here to type in your comments. Another part of the call for information is parcel identification. So the regulator is seeking information on possible parcel locations within the government designated wind energy areas. So these were the three areas identified by governments in their strategic direction letter, which are Sydney Bight, Middlebank, and French Bank. To nominate an area within the wind energy areas noted in Appendix C of the strategic direction letter, please follow the instructions described in the offshore wind nomination form, which I have on the next slide. The CNSOER will review all nominations submitted, and the final parcel configurations will be included in our recommendation to the ministers for their review and approval process as set out in legislation. So this is what the offshore wind nomination form looks like. So the form itself is one page. It's on the left-hand side of your screen, which I'll go through in a moment. But if you are considering to fill this out, please consider the details outlined in the government strategic direction letter when forming your nomination. There are some considerations to consider here about proximity to shoreline, energy targets, etc. So what we're looking for is potential wind developers to complete the form, compile all your associated mapping files, and email them to callforbids@cnsoer.ca. On the form itself, there are some other helpful links that can help you with your nominations. So in particular, a link to a shapefile for our land division guidelines is down at the bottom of the form right here. So this is a guideline that helps you understand how it is that we divide up land in the offshore area. We have land division shapefiles. So these will provide you the boundaries that we would like you to adhere to. And if you aren't able to do this, this is something we will do internally anyway once we receive a nomination. We also have available the shapefiles for the wind energy areas themselves for download. So this is a zip file of the shapefiles, or a zip file of the wind energy areas to download and bring into your own PC for use. The form itself, there's a small paragraph at the top to walk you through how to fill it out. But what we're looking for is the name of the individual company or consortium nominating, the wind energy area in which your nomination exists, the approximate size of your nomination, and the approximate energy generation capacity, whether you're considering this to be fixed or floating. And then we're looking for some identifying information about the submitter itself. And again, once all mapping files are compiled and the form is filled out, please submit it to the call for bids email address. So now available on our website is a tool that we've called the Wind Energy Area Spatial Data Viewer. And I'm going to walk you through how this viewer can potentially help inform some of your feedback or your nominations. So this is a tool. It's available on our website here on our offshore wind land tenure processes main page. It's this box down here, which I have highlighted in yellow. If you click here, it will bring you to a second link and where you can launch the viewer, which looks like this. So the viewer, you can see here the buffer that we have on the coastline of Nova Scotia, and then the 4 wind energy areas, but bathymetric contours specific to those wind energy areas. If you zoom in to these wind energy areas, these contours will label automatically. So they're a bit dynamic as you move in and out through this map viewer. There's a series of layers up in the upper left-hand corner over here. And then there's a dynamic legend down in the bottom left right here. So as you post a layer, you will see that this legend updates to give you the according information related to the layer that you have posted at the time. This can get a little busy as you start turning on more and more layers. So there is functionality here where you can click the 6 dots over here and you can drag layers to be above or below other layers. If you see an arrow beside one of the layers right here, it means it's expandable and that there's a deeper level of detail available within those wind air with the area that you're considering turning on. Some other useful things, something that I'm using quite frequently, you have the ability to measure in here. So there's a series of widgets up in the upper right-hand corner. If you click on the one here that looks like a ruler, you can measure distances. So in this case here, the example I have on the screen is where I've measured the distance from a northern part of Middlebank to the edge of the buffer around Nova Scotia, and you can see that that distance there is about 35 kilometers. You can also measure area. So in this case here, you can see I've drawn a polygon just north of the Middlebank wind energy area, and it's telling me that the area of this polygon right here is 207 square kilometers. So a couple of useful tools if you're looking to understand any distances or potential areas and want to use that to inform any feedback or nomination that you're providing to us. If you're curious about the layers and perhaps you want to use these layers for yourself, a lot of them are where we're just reaching out to other organizations to access their publicly available data sets. So if you click up here in the link symbol, it will bring up a list, and everything in this list here is actually a live link. So you can click here and you can get back to the original source, use the source for yourself, or at least just confirm that where we're getting the sources from. The last thing that I'll mention here is I'm not going through the spatial data viewer in its entirety. If you want to walk through, there is a user guide available here in this overflow widget up in the uppermost right-hand corner. It will walk you through the legend, the layers, the base map, how to measure, where our data sources are, bookmarks, and to print. So before I move on, this widget off to the far right here, if you click this, it does bring in a menu where you can print. So if you've developed a nice map where you have a lot of things turned on that you'd like to consider and you'd like to print it to keep for another time, you can do so by clicking over here. So the Wind Energy Aerospatial Data Viewer really is a mapping tool. So it's not really releasing data sets per se through there, but we've always had an information management center in place as well. So this is where there's free access to offshore data. This is available in 2 different forms. So we have a digital form, which is what you see the screen grab for here on the screen. Once you have a username and password, you can log in and access a lot of historical data as collected and curated by us throughout the history of our organization. At this point, it is predominantly oil and gas data, but a lot of it does serve a dual purpose. In particular, there's a lot of reports on here that speak to historic weather patterns, weather stations for offshore installations, and even some of the site assessment work done for positioning of rigs is quite valuable to understanding the shallow subsurface. So a lot of this data is available on our website here once you have a username and password. So I encourage you to go check it out and download data as you see fit. We also have a physical operation as well, where you can have, there's a public viewing and a laboratory set up for sampling and viewing cores and rocks and samples. I would like to note that this digital center is planned to be modernized in 2026, 2027. So as for the call for information, after the call for information NS25-1R closes on January 13th, all feedback collected through public written comments, the virtual public information webinar, which was held last week, and nominations will be reviewed prior to the CNSOER making offshore renewable energy recommendations to ministers. Following that, there's a series of next steps as well in terms of land tenure process. So we're kind of going back to the chart here a bit, but it's good to just get the point across. So we will be reviewing and assessing all information received. So the nominations, the feedback received through the call for information feedback form, and then the pre-qualification applications themselves. So once the regulator has received all of this information and reviewed it, it will be informing our offshore renewable energy recommendation back to ministers. In particular, it will inform what the call for bids itself looks like, the terms and conditions of the submerged land license, and this will go forward to the ministers as mentioned, subject to ministers' review and approval. Following that, there will be a offshore wind call for bids, and at that point, then once the call for bids is open and closed, the review of the bids from the pre-qualified companies will be done by the regulator. We will again then be making an offshore renewable energy recommendation back to ministers. This recommendation would be to issue submerged land licenses to the submerged bidders. And this again is subject to ministers' review and approval. Following that, it would be the issuance of submerged land licenses. So it's an important point to keep in mind here is that the end of that process really is just getting the submerged land license issued to the developers. And a point I made on my original slide is really that's really just your license at that point. No work or activity on the water can be done without authorizations issued by our office. The authorizations fall into three broad categories, which you can see in the chevrons across the top of the screen here. So there's a site assessment authorization, construction operations and maintenance authorization, and a decommissioning authorization. Each of which requires a lot of other submissions to accompany it as it comes our way. These may include activity description, the safety plan, environmental protection plan, impact assessment or environmental assessment, emergency response plan, risk assessments, there's financial requirements, fisheries communication and engagement plan, Indigenous community and engagement plan, and then any other requirements depending on the activity being authorized. So with that, to my final slide, most of this presentation has really been about the first bullet here, but the CNSOER, we are the regulator for offshore energy activities. We administer the land processes through our call for bids process. We ensure regulatory requirements are met before granting an authorization and before offshore activities commence. We will be implementing effective monitoring programs, ensuring compliance with legislative requirements, and we'll do our best to work activities are completed in a safe and environmentally responsible manner. Thank you. Back to you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Kris. That was great. Really excited to see that new digital mapping tool. I think that's going to be really useful for folks. Now we're going to open the floor to some questions. We've already had a number be submitted while you're talking, which is great. One kind of theme that I'm seeing here and a number of questions is about geophysical survey data. What geophysical survey data is going to be made available? Kind of what kinds of data is that? The coverage and the scope, is it geophysical, geotechnical? And kind of the timeline, if that is to be shared, will that be during the pre-qualification process or once the bid opens, will folks be able to have access to more of those site-specific data components?
Yeah, sure. So I think what the questioner is getting at here is there's definitely been a series of programs undertaken by Natural Resources Canada to collect data sets within the wind energy areas themselves to just to understand a bit more about site conditions. The data sets through recent conversations that I've had with governments who are really the owners of these data sets. It's not the regulator, and they haven't been submitted to us as a formal submission, I guess. They are working to have these data sets available publicly. I'm I'm thinking that in the short term here, you will hear some news from governments on how and when these data sets will be released. Unfortunately, it's not something I can give a precise date to at this point, but I just encourage you to stay tuned. Ideally, I think they're aiming to have this available before a call for bids. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for being able to provide some insights on that, even though it's not specifically your jurisdiction. A little follow-up question there on data. In the mapping tool, there was a tab there for where the data came from. Is most of that publicly available? You kind of touched on that, but can folks kind of go to that tab and follow links to download and use those shapefiles?
Yes, they can. So a lot of what we've done there are either web map services from other groups or REST services. So these are basically just links to published data sets from other groups, whether it's DFO, Department of National Defense, or Transport Canada. And one of the buttons that I highlighted there, if you click on it, it will bring up that long list. And if you click on it, it will bring you directly to the data source itself. One thing that I did mention is, we're always looking to improve this tool. So if people are aware of other public data sets that could be incorporated in here, please reach out and we can do our best to include them in the viewer.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Um, Another question here. Will the list of pre-qualified companies be made public, or is this something that's going to be private?
Yes. So pre-qualified companies is the list is not going to be made public unless a pre-qualifying company wishes for their name to be made public. Otherwise, it will be treated as sensitive information and not be publicly posted. No.
Okay. Okay, great. We have a few kind of maybe shorter ones so we can get through here. You might not know this specifically yet, but is there a duration that you're expecting for the call for bids phase, or you're still soliciting feedback, it sounds like, on that, but is there any light you could shed there?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we are still soliciting feedback, so it's certainly not locked in. We're considering a period of 60 to 90 days. But if people have feedback on that, particularly developers, if this is enough time to collate all your material and prepare a bid, we'd like to hear from you on that duration of time. I encourage you to submit it through our feedback form online, please. Yeah.
okay, great. Um, Question that I myself had, and that another individual has commented here, is about kind of formal and informal requirements for local supply chain content and looking at engaging with local communities. How are these components going to tie into the pre-qualification process or the submission for a bidder?
Yeah, so they're both tied into both the pre-qualification and potentially going forward in the call for bids criteria as well. So whether it's a submission of a plan that outlines the developer's knowledge of the local supply chain or community benefits, or their plan to generate a community benefits plan itself, we are looking for that information right up front at both potentially at the bidding stage and hints of it in the pre-qualification as well. It also will come later. It could come later in some of the activity or the authorizations as well. But yes, it's something that we're considering including at multiple stages throughout the land tenure process.
Okay, great. Um, there's a number of more questions here just for folks that are wanting to ask a question. Once again, type them there in the Q&A box, and we're working through a list. Um, what do we have here? Do you know how many licenses are going to be issued? Will it be kind of one for each area? There was direction on this that was sent in the strategic direction letter. But are you expecting a number of different bidders to be successful in the same energy areas?
Yeah, what I can say to that one now is we're following the guidance provided to us in the strategic direction letters, which did outline energy targets. So for Sydney Bight, it was at least one parcel for 500 megawatts. For Middlebank, it was at least two parcels for 1 gigawatt each. And for French Bank, it was one parcel for 500 megawatts. The additional part that was in that strategic direction letter is that, yes, that's a total of 3 gigawatts, but regulator, if you see interest for 5 gigawatts of licenses, please let the ministers know through our recommendation back to them. So right now that currently lays out a minimum of 4 parcels, I guess, if all successful, with the considering of an additional 2 gigawatts to bring in a total up to 5 if the interest is there.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Kris, if you want to open the Q&A tab too and see if there's any there jumping out at you.
Yeah.
One here, this might not be necessarily the CNSOER's responsibility, but is there any plans do you know of for the government to collect meta-ocean data? If there's any talks about any data collection campaigns, or anything of that nature kind of brewing at the moment?
That's one that I'm probably not best to answer. It would be funded by governments. I have heard it talked about to potentially be done in conjunction with a lot of the site condition data sets, but I'd have to push that one off for governments for a firmer answer. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Um, so with the permitting requirements, you're kind of collecting, I guess, some of what these requirements will be through the call for information. Um, some of these, are they already established? And is there going to be kind of concrete information made public outlining these criteria?
Okay. So permitting criteria going forward, I mean, we're open to considering changes right now. So, it's hard to lock anything in without considering all the feedback that's
Mhm.
about to be received. Aside from the process that we've already started, which is pre-qualification and call for information. So, if people have feedback on the permitting process going forward, I'd encourage them to submit it to through our formal channel. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. Maybe we have a few minutes left. Maybe we'll pick one or two more out of the
Sure.
pile here. Um, Kind of a question of my own. What you mentioned Fisheries Advisory Committee, and that's kind of been something that existed back in the CNSOPB days.
Yeah.
What role is that having now with the renewable energy mandate, and what's that relationship looking like there?
Yeah, so it's a good relationship. The Fisheries Advisory Committee was established to help us, better understand the needs and concerns of the fishing industry itself. It does a great job of acting as a line of communication between CNSOER staff and fishers and fisher representatives. So at these meetings, Fisheries Advisory Committee members provide advice and suggestions for us to consider, and such things such as the activity authorizations, applications, and they also have an opportunity to provide input into our guidelines as well. We then use the time too to update them on any active processes that we have in place. So I attended a meeting recently to do a similar presentation to what we just did here today, to outline the call for information and pre-qualification processes, and then what follows afterwards as well. The committee members, because we have direct access to them too, we also provide them with notice of any environmental assessments, strategic environmental assessments, call for bids, and they're really one of the first to hear through our channels, and then they're invited to submit comments on all these aspects as well.
Great. I'm glad to hear that that's still ongoing and sounds really effective in helping the sector move forward. Um, This might be a question also for governments, but you've kind of mentioned the environmental impact assessment process there. Do you know of any key aspects that might be required from an environmental point of view that's um, sort of a part of the permitting mandate, I guess, as well, the CNSOER, but things like eDNA, like any guesses there?
Yeah, that one's a bit of a challenging one for me to answer. I'd have to probably bring that one back to my office and look for some help from others in my group here before I could give a pretty confident answer on that one, unfortunately. Yeah.
No, that's fair enough. Um, It's also a little bit further down the line, so totally understand that. Maybe we'll do one more question here. Um, I guess you've kind of spoken a lot to this, but to sort of wrap things up and looking ahead, what are the next major milestones that people should be aware of for stakeholders to be involved, as well as for developers and supply chain service providers to be involved as well in the procurement process?
Yeah, so I think the thing to watch for here is, I had it multiple times in the presentation, I guess, but the dates for when this period closes, so the pre-qualification and call for information, so that's mid-January, and then at that point we have a lot of work to do, the regulator, to form our recommendation to go to ministers. So those are the two key things that are on the horizon to watch for. If it's suppliers or consultants who are watching this process right now, if you were following along to the land tenure process, there's a license or licenses to be issued in 2026, meaning activity on the water probably at the earliest could be 2027. So if there's supply chain workers or consulting firms who are looking, for when we can engage and when can we participate, it's probably in that time frame. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for fielding all of those questions, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Um, for folks that have joined that have found this webinar interesting, once again, feel free to check out our website. We have a bank of all of our previous webinars there on a number of various topics that you might find interesting, and we'll have this webinar uploaded shortly as well to share with colleagues that might not have been able to make it today. With that, thanks again for everybody, and special thanks to Chris. That was really, really great. Enjoy your holiday season, everybody, and the rest of your weeks. Bye for now.
Thank you.